My name is Valerie. I am 34 years old, and I built a successful law career in Chicago after escaping my mother's abuse. When I was 16, she kicked me out, and I endured unspeakable things just to survive. Now, after almost 2 decades of silence, she suddenly reappeared with a lawsuit demanding access to my children. What she didn't count on was that the broken girl she discarded has become a woman who knows how to fight back. Before I share my story, let me know where you're watching from, and please hit like and subscribe if you want to hear more about how I overcame adversity and found justice after years of pain. I grew up in a modest suburban house that looked perfect from the outside. White picket fence, neatly trimmed lawns, seasonal decorations on the door. But behind that facade lived my mother Susan, a woman whose mood could shift from saccharine sweet to violently enraged in seconds. From my earliest memories, I walked on eggshells, never knowing what might trigger her next explosion. The rules in our house changed daily, sometimes hourly. One day I'd be punished for leaving a glass on the counter. The next day, I'd be screamed at for putting it away in the wrong cabinet. There was no consistency, no way to predict what might set her off. Susan controlled every aspect of my existence. My clothes were carefully inspected before I left the house. Anything she deemed provocative or attention-seeking was immediately thrown away or burned in the backyard as I watched tears streaming down my face. Friends were rarely allowed over, and when they were, Susan would hover listening to every word. After they left, she'd criticize them mercilessly. "That Amanda girl is trash just like her mother," she'd say. "I can tell she's going to be pregnant before high school's over." Eventually, I stopped bringing friends home altogether. It was easier to be lonely than to expose others to her cruelty or face her interrogations afterward. My academic achievements were never enough. An A- was treated as a failure. "Are you stupid?" she'd ask, tapping her finger against my forehead. "Is anything getting through that thick skull?" If I cried, she'd mock me. "Look at the baby always with the waterworks. You think crying will get you anywhere in life? Pathetic." The physical abuse started subtly. A harsh grip on my arm that left fingerprint bruises. A playful slap that made my ears ring. By the time I was 12, it had escalated. Susan would grab me by my hair and slam me against walls. She'd lock me in my bedroom for entire weekends without food if I disrespected her, which could mean anything from sighing too loudly to making eye contact for too long. My father left when I was 4. I barely remember him. Sometimes I'd overhear Susan on the phone screaming about child support payments that rarely came. When I asked about him, she'd tell me he never wanted me. "He left because you were such a difficult child," she'd say. "He couldn't stand your whining." Years later, I learned he died in a car accident when I was 9. Susan never told me. There were no other relatives to turn to. Susan had systematically cut ties with everyone in her family, telling me they were all terrible people who had abused her. I now suspect she isolated herself to ensure no one would witness how she treated me. School became my sanctuary. I threw myself into studying, joining every club and activity I could. Anything to stay away from home. The library became my haven. I'd sit there until closing time, dreading the moment I'd have to return to Susan's unpredictable rage. In my sophomore year of high school, I met Ms. Thompson, my English teacher. She noticed something in me that others missed. After I submitted an essay about resilience, she asked me to stay after class. "You write with such depth about pain," she said carefully. "Is everything okay at home?" I panicked and assured her everything was fine, but she gave me her personal phone number. "Just in case you ever need to talk," she said. I memorized it but was too afraid to use it. I never told anyone the truth. The few times social services had been called, Susan transformed into the perfect mother. She'd cry about how difficult I was, how she was doing her best as a single mother. The social workers would leave sympathetic to her, suspicious of me. Afterward, the punishment would be severe. "No one will ever believe you," she'd whisper as she twisted my arm behind my back. "You're nothing. You're no one." By junior year, I was at the top of my class despite everything. My guidance counselor encouraged me to apply for a prestigious summer program at Northwestern University for high school students interested in law. When I was accepted with a full scholarship, I felt a flicker of hope for the first time. Maybe this could be my ticket out. Maybe I could go to college and never come back. The day I received the acceptance letter, I held off showing Susan until after dinner, when she was usually in her calmest mood. I'd prepared a whole speech about how it wouldn't cost her anything, how it would look good on college applications, how I'd still be able to do chores on weekends. None of it mattered. The moment she realized I wanted to spend 6 weeks away from her control, her face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little bitch!" she hissed, ripping the letter to shreds. "You think you're better than me? You think these fancy college people want you, they just need diversity cases to meet their quotas." When I tried to explain the opportunity, she slapped me hard enough that I tasted blood. "You're planning to leave me, aren't you?" she screamed, throwing a plate that shattered against the wall. "After everything I've sacrificed for you, this is how you repay me." Something in me broke that night. After 16 years of submission, I finally stood up for myself. "Yes," I said quietly. "I want to leave. I can't live like this anymore." Susan went eerily quiet, which was always more frightening than her screaming. "Get out," she said, her voice flat. "Get out of my house. If you're so grown up, so ready to leave, then go. Now." I thought she was bluffing. I'd seen this tactic before, where she'd threaten something extreme, then punish me for taking her seriously. "Mom, I just want to go to the program. I'll come back." "You have 10 minutes to pack a bag," she said, her eyes cold. "Anything left behind gets burned. And don't come crawling back when those people see you for what you really are. No one will ever love you like I have." In a daze, I stuffed a backpack with clothes, my school notebooks, and the one photo I had of my father. As I reached for my birth certificate in my desk drawer, Susan appeared in the doorway. "That stays," she said. "You want to be on your own, fine, but all your documents belong to me." Before I could argue, she grabbed my arm and dragged me to the front door, throwing my backpack onto the porch. 16 years I wasted on you," she said. 16 years I'll never get back." Then she slammed the door in my face. I stood there frozen, unable to process what had happened. I kept expecting her to open the door to scream more abuse, but let me back in. She didn't. After an hour sitting on the porch steps, I finally accepted that she meant it. I was homeless. That first night, I wandered aimlessly until I found myself at a small public park. I sat on a bench, clutching my backpack to my chest, jumping at every sound. I didn't sleep. How could I? Everything I'd ever known, however terrible, had been ripped away in an instant. I had nowhere to go and no idea what to do next. The second night, I discovered the public library stayed open until 9. I could sit there pretending to study until closing. The mall closed at 10. If I timed it right, I could spend evenings moving between these places, delaying the moment when I'd have to find somewhere to sleep. For the first week, I rotated between the park, the bus station, and a 24-hour diner where a kind waitress named Dorothy would let me sit for hours nursing a single cup of coffee. "You in some kind of trouble, honey?" she asked on my third visit. I shook my head. "Just studying late." I lied. The look in her eyes told me she didn't believe me, but she didn't press further. I continued going to school, arriving early to use the locker room showers when no one was around. I washed my clothes in bathroom sinks and dried them under hand dryers. I became an expert at maintaining appearances. No one suspected I had nowhere to go after the final bell. Finding work proved nearly impossible. Everywhere asked for ID, which Susan had kept. Without a permanent address or phone number, most places wouldn't even give me an application. I managed to get cash jobs here and there, helping an elderly man clean his garage, babysitting for a woman who didn't ask too many questions. But it was never enough for a security deposit on an apartment, especially with no rental history or references. One night, when the temperature dropped unexpectedly, I found myself huddled in the train station trying to stay warm. A middle-aged woman sat down beside me. Her name was Francine, and she'd been homeless for 3 years after losing her job and then her house to medical bills. "You're new to this," she stated, not asked. "First rule of street survival, baby girl, you find your people. Nobody makes it alone out here." Francine introduced me to a small community of homeless individuals who looked out for each other. They showed me safer places to sleep, soup kitchens where I could get a hot meal, churches that distributed hygiene products. They taught me to avoid certain areas after dark and which public bathrooms were safest to use. Most importantly, they gave me a sense that I wasn't completely alone. But my situation was taking a toll. My grades began to slip as exhaustion became my constant companion. Dark circles formed under my eyes. My clothes, despite my best efforts, began to look perpetually rumpled. People at school started to notice. 2 months after being kicked out, Ms. Thompson pulled me aside after class. "Valerie," she said gently, "I've noticed you're wearing the same clothes several days in a row. You seem tired and your last 2 assignments weren't up to your usual standard." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Is there something going on at home?" I tried to maintain my composure, but after weeks of constant stress and fear, something inside me cracked. Tears spilled down my cheeks before I could stop them. "I don't have a home," I whispered. Ms. Thompson's office became another safe space. She brought me food, offered to let me use her classroom to study after hours, and even washed some of my clothes in the faculty lounge. She wanted to report my situation to social services, but I begged her not to. "I'm almost 17, I explained. "If they put me in foster care now, I'll age out in a year anyway. And if my mother finds out where I am—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Reluctantly, she agreed not to report it, but insisted on helping me find more stable arrangements. She connected me with a youth outreach worker who started looking into emergency housing options. But the waiting lists were long, and my situation wasn't considered high priority without visible signs of abuse. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort or constant fear. It was watching my dream of college slip away. The summer program deadline passed. My grades continued to decline. How could I think about a future when basic survival consumed every ounce of my energy? One rainy evening, as I huddled in a bus shelter wondering where I'd sleep that night, a car pulled up. The driver rolled down his window. "You need somewhere dry to stay?" he asked. "I've got a couch you can crash on." I hesitated, remembering Francine's warnings about strangers. But the rain was coming down harder, and I was so tired of being cold and wet and afraid. Against my better judgment, I got in his car. His name was Jack. He was 24, worked construction, and had an apartment on the south side of the city. That first night, he truly did just offer his couch. He gave me a towel, a blanket, and left me alone. I slept better than I had in months. In the morning, he made breakfast. "You can stay a few days if you need to get on your feet," he said. I thanked him profusely, believing I'd found a genuinely kind person in a world that had shown me little kindness. That naive belief would cost me more than I could have imagined. For the first week at Jack's apartment, things seemed almost normal. He went to work during the day, I went to school, and in the evenings we'd watch TV or he'd play video games while I caught up on homework. He didn't ask many questions about my situation, which was a relief. I didn't want to explain my mother or why I couldn't go home. Looking back, I realize now that his lack of curiosity wasn't respect for my privacy. He simply didn't care about my story. He saw a vulnerable girl and recognized an opportunity. The shift happened gradually. First, he commented that groceries were expensive, hinting that I should contribute financially. When I explained I was struggling to find work, he suggested I could help out in other ways. I offered to clean the apartment, cook meals, do laundry. For a while, that seemed enough. Then came the night he returned home drunk. I was already asleep on the couch when he stumbled in reeking of whiskey. He sat down heavily beside me, his hand landing on my leg. "You know," he slurred, "most girls would show more appreciation for a guy letting them stay rent-free." I froze suddenly, very aware of how isolated I was. No one knew where I was. I had nowhere else to go. "I do appreciate it," I said carefully. "I can make breakfast tomorrow or—" He laughed, cutting me off. "That's not the kind of appreciation I'm talking about, sweetheart." What happened next still haunts me. I won't describe the details. I can't. But that night marked the beginning of an arrangement I never agreed to but couldn't escape. My body became the currency that paid for my shelter. Afterward, Jack acted like nothing had changed. He made coffee the next morning, asked about my classes, normal conversation that felt surreal after what had happened. When I flinched as he walked past, he pretended not to notice. I considered leaving, but the question remained to go where? The street where I might face the same or worse from strangers with no roof overhead. Back to my mother, who would view my return as confirmation of everything she'd ever said about my worthlessness. So I stayed. And it happened again. And again. Until it became a routine, an expected part of living under his roof. I learned to dissociate, to let my mind float somewhere above my body during these encounters. I'd stare at a crack in the ceiling, count the water stains on the wall, anything to mentally escape. During this time, I managed to get a job at a fast food restaurant. The manager was willing to pay me under the table since I still didn't have proper ID. The pay was minimal, but it gave me a small sense of independence and a legitimate reason to be out of the apartment. I started picking up as many shifts as possible, even if it meant falling asleep during classes. Ms. Thompson noticed my deterioration. "Valerie, you're falling asleep in class. Your last paper was barely coherent. Whatever's going on, please let me help you." I couldn't tell her the truth. The shame was overwhelming. Instead, I made excuses about my job, about staying up late studying. She didn't believe me, but without more information, there was little she could do except continue to offer support and extensions on assignments. I developed strategies to minimize my time with Jack. I'd volunteer for closing shifts at the restaurant, arriving home after he was asleep. I'd leave for school before he woke. I spent weekends studying in the library until closing. But no matter how I arranged my schedule, there were still nights when avoidance was impossible. The psychological effects were profound. I stopped making eye contact with people. I showered multiple times a day but never felt clean. I lost weight as my appetite disappeared. I began having panic attacks in small, confined spaces. I developed insomnia, afraid to fall asleep in case Jack came home unexpectedly. My sense of self-worth, already damaged by years of my mother's abuse, crumbled completely. I started believing I deserved what was happening, that this was all someone like me could expect from life. The future I'd once dreamed of seemed like a childish fantasy. Girls like me didn't become lawyers or doctors. We survived day by day, paying whatever price was demanded. 4 months into this nightmare, I missed my period. At first, I tried to convince myself it was stress or poor nutrition. But as weeks passed, I could no longer deny the possibility. Using money I'd been saving for a security deposit on my own place, I bought a pregnancy test. 2 pink lines. My world collapsed all over again. When I told Jack, his reaction was immediate and violent. He accused me of trying to trap him, of lying about being on birth control. I wasn't, but he had never asked or offered protection. He called me names I won't repeat and threw a lamp across the room that shattered against the wall. "Get rid of it," he demanded. "I'm not supporting some kid." I sat there numb. I didn't want a child, not like this, not with him. But I had no health insurance, no money for a procedure, no idea where to even begin addressing this new crisis. Jack threw a wadded-up $20 bill at me. "That's all you're getting from me. Figure it out or get out." That night, curled up on the bathroom floor after Jack had gone to sleep, I reached a breaking point. This couldn't be my life. I couldn't bring a child into this situation. I had to find a way out no matter what. With shaking hands, I finally did something I should have done months earlier. I called Ms. Thompson. "I'm coming to get you," Ms. Thompson said immediately after I tearfully explained where I was and what had been happening. "Pack whatever you can carry. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I glanced nervously at the bedroom door behind which Jack was sleeping. "He might wake up," I whispered. "Valerie, listen to me." Her voice was firm but gentle. "This is not your fault. None of it. But right now, we need to get you somewhere safe. Is there a place nearby where you can wait? A coffee shop or store?" I thought of the 24-hour convenience store 2 blocks away. "Yes." "Go there now. I'm getting in my car." With heart pounding, I stuffed my few belongings into my backpack, took the money I'd been saving from my hiding place inside a hollow book, and slipped out of the apartment. The cool night air hit my face as I hurried down the street, constantly looking over my shoulder. Ms. Thompson was waiting when I arrived, her car idling at the curb. She didn't ask questions during the drive, just reached across the console and squeezed my hand. She took me to her sister's house in a quiet neighborhood across town. Katie was a nurse who had an empty guest room and a compassionate heart. "You can stay as long as you need," she told me, showing me to a clean, bright bedroom that looked like something from another world compared to Jack's grimy apartment. That night, I slept in a real bed without fear for the first time in months. In the morning, Ms. Thompson returned with Sarah, a social worker specializing in youth homelessness and exploitation. Sarah didn't judge or lecture. Instead, she laid out options. "There's a youth shelter with an opening," she explained. "It's specifically for teens in situations like yours. They have counselors, legal advocates, and medical staff on site." She paused, her eyes kind. "Including reproductive health services if you need them." 3 days later, I moved into Hope House, a converted Victorian home that housed up to 12 young women at a time. Each resident had responsibilities from cooking to cleaning, but also access to services many of us had gone without: medical care, therapy, legal aid to help with emancipation paperwork. It was there I made the difficult decision about my pregnancy. The staff supported me without pressure in either direction. After much reflection, I chose termination. The procedure was arranged through a clinic that worked with the shelter costs covered by a nonprofit fund. Recovery, both physical and emotional, was difficult. The shelter provided individual and group therapy, where for the first time I heard other girls tell stories with echoes of my own. I wasn't alone. I wasn't uniquely broken or deserving of what had happened. My therapist, Dr. Lowenstein, specialized in trauma. "What you're experiencing is a normal response to abnormal circumstances," she explained during one session. "Your brain and body were trying to protect you the only ways they knew how." Slowly, I began to rebuild. I returned to school with new supports in place. The shelter had a quiet study room and computers for homework. A volunteer tutor helped me catch up in classes where I'd fallen behind. My grades improved, and with them, my hope for the future. The shelter's legal advocate helped me file for legal emancipation, citing my mother's abandonment and abuse. Susan didn't even show up for the hearing. With emancipation granted, I could finally get copies of my birth certificate and social security card, open a bank account, apply for financial aid. During my senior year, Ms. Thompson encouraged me to apply for college scholarships again. "You've overcome more than most adults face in a lifetime," she said. "Tell your story, not for pity, but to show your resilience." With her help, I wrote essays that carefully framed my experiences as challenges I'd overcome through determination and support. I didn't mention the sexual abuse or pregnancy, focusing instead on homelessness and finding community resources. When acceptance letters arrived that spring, including one with a full scholarship to the state university, the entire shelter celebrated with me. For the first time since being kicked out, I could see a future beyond daily survival. I graduated high school with honors despite everything. My mother didn't attend the ceremony, but the shelter staff and Ms. Thompson cheered loudly enough to make up for it. That summer, I moved into year-round university housing, working in the campus bookstore to cover expenses not included in my scholarship. I declared pre-law as my major, inspired by the legal advocates who had helped me navigate emancipation. Maybe someday I could do for others what they had done for me. My first college roommate was Rachel, a cheerful sociology major who played violin and stayed up too late reading mystery novels. We couldn't have been more different, but her natural warmth slowly broke through the walls I'd built. One night, after months of friendship, I finally told her fragments of my story. Instead of the pity or disgust I feared, she hugged me and said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." It was the beginning of learning to trust again, a process that would take years, but started with that single conversation in our shared dorm room. College became a time of slow but steady healing. Away from both my mother and Jack, surrounded by new people who knew nothing of my past, I could begin reinventing myself. Not by denying what had happened, but by refusing to let it define my future. I threw myself into my studies with the same intensity that had once helped me escape my mother's house through books. My professors noted my commitment, my detailed case analyses, my willingness to debate complex legal questions. What they didn't know was that understanding the law felt like gaining power over a system that had failed to protect me. During sophomore year, I joined a campus advocacy group for survivors of sexual assault. Initially, I attended meetings silently, just listening. Eventually, I began sharing pieces of my experience, careful to maintain emotional boundaries while still connecting with others. These meetings were where I first heard the term survivor instead of victim and recognized the strength in that distinction. I also continued therapy through the University Counseling Center. My new therapist, Dr. Marshall, specialized in complex trauma. She introduced me to techniques for managing flashbacks and panic attacks. Healing isn't linear, she reminded me often. There will be setbacks. That doesn't mean you're failing. There were indeed setbacks. Nightmares that left me gasping for breath. Days when I couldn't bear to be touched even accidentally in crowded hallways. Moments when a particular smell or sound would catapult me back to Jack's apartment or my mother's kitchen. But gradually, these episodes became less frequent, less overwhelming. In my junior year, I met Thomas during a mock trial competition. Tall with glasses and a serious demeanor that softened into unexpected humor when relaxed, he approached legal questions with both intellectual rigor and compassion. We were paired as opposing counsel in a practice case, but found ourselves continuing discussions long after formal arguments ended. Our relationship developed slowly, as friendships do when built on mutual respect. We studied together, debated legal theories, eventually began sharing meals and attending campus events as a pair. When he finally asked if I'd like to make this official, I panicked. "I have baggage," I told him bluntly. "Things in my past that make relationships difficult." Thomas didn't press for details. "Everyone has a history," he said simply. "I'm interested in getting to know you, not just your past." It took 6 more months before I could bring myself to be physically intimate with him, and even then there were complications. Moments when I'd dissociate or need to stop abruptly. Thomas never showed frustration, only concern. "We have time," he'd assure me. "There's no rush." His patience gave me space to relearn what a healthy relationship felt like, to experience physical affection as something freely given, not extracted as payment, to express boundaries and have them respected. These were revolutionary concepts for someone raised by Susan and exploited by Jack. We graduated together, Thomas with offers from prestigious firms, me with acceptance to the State University's law school and a partial scholarship. The night before graduation, he proposed. Not with a grand gesture, but during a quiet moment on campus, sitting beneath the oak tree where we'd first studied together. "I don't need an answer now," he said, the small ring box open between us. "I just want you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." I surprised myself by saying yes immediately. Some part of me, the part that had been healing steadily over those years, recognized that fear of commitment would always exist, but letting it dictate my choices meant letting my abusers continue controlling my life. We married after my first year of law school, a small ceremony with friends from college, Thomas's large, boisterous family, and a few special guests, including Ms. Thompson and Sarah from the youth shelter. Susan was not invited. As far as I knew, she had no idea where I was or what had become of me. Law school was challenging but fulfilling. I specialized in family law, particularly cases involving child welfare and domestic violence. My experiences gave me insight that textbooks couldn't provide, though I was careful about when and how much to disclose professionally. After passing the bar, I joined a nonprofit legal center that provided services to women and children escaping abuse. The pay was modest compared to what Thomas earned at his corporate firm, but the work felt like my calling. Every restraining order granted, every custody arrangement that prioritized child safety, every successful relocation of a family in danger felt like a personal victory. 2 years into our marriage, we bought a small house in a family-friendly suburb. A year later, I discovered I was pregnant. Unlike my first pregnancy, this news brought joy tinged with anxiety. Could someone with my history be a good parent? Would the trauma resurface during pregnancy or childbirth? My medical team, fully informed about my past, created a specialized care plan. Thomas attended every appointment, every childbirth class. Together with my therapist, we developed strategies for managing potential triggers during delivery. Emma was born on a snowy January morning after 20 hours of labor. When the nurse placed her in my arms, I felt a fierce protective love unlike anything I'd experienced. Looking into her tiny face, I made a silent promise she would never know the pain I had known. She would grow up safe, secure in the knowledge that she was loved unconditionally. 2 years later, James joined our family, our house filled with the chaos and joy of young children. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, never using work as an excuse to avoid diaper changes or middle-of-the-night feedings. We established family traditions that had been absent in my childhood: Sunday pancake breakfasts, bedtime stories, holiday celebrations that focused on togetherness rather than perfection. Throughout these years, I maintained a deliberate distance from my past. I never searched for Susan online or drove past our old house when visiting my hometown. I never reported Jack to the authorities, though I sometimes wondered if he had victimized others after me. These were conscious choices, part of maintaining the boundaries that kept my new life separate from the trauma of my old one. Thomas knew most of my history by now, shared in fragments over years of trust building. His parents knew only that I was estranged from my family due to irreconcilable differences. Our children knew nothing except that they didn't have a grandmother on my side of the family. This careful separation of past and present worked for nearly 20 years, until the day a certified letter arrived at our home addressed to me from a law firm I didn't recognize. The envelope sat unopened on our kitchen counter for hours. Something about the formal typeface of the return address filled me with inexplicable dread. When Thomas arrived home from work, he found me staring at it. "Bad news?" he asked, loosening his tie. "I don't know," I admitted. "I haven't opened it." He squeezed my shoulder gently. "Want me to?" I nodded, sliding the envelope toward him. He broke the seal and unfolded the document inside. As he read, his expression darkened. "Valerie," he said carefully, "it's from your mother's attorney. She's seeking visitation rights with Emma and James." The room seemed to tilt sideways. My ears rang. This couldn't be happening. Susan didn't even know about my children. She couldn't. I'd been so careful. Thomas guided me to a chair, his voice coming from far away as he continued reading the letter. Phrases floated through the fog of my panic. Grandmother's rights, reconciliation, relationship with her grandchildren, changed circumstances. How did she find us? My voice sounded strange, detached. "Your recent promotion," Thomas said grimly. "The nonprofit's website featured you in that press release about the Domestic Violence Prevention Initiative. Your name and photo were published." The promotion I'd been so proud of had led Susan right to our doorstep. The irony was bitter. My work protecting others from abusers had exposed my own family to one. "We don't have to respond," Thomas suggested. "We could ignore it." But the lawyer in me knew better. "She's filed a formal petition. If we ignore it, she could get a default judgment." My professional calm was returning, protecting me from emotional collapse. "We need to fight this legally." That night, after the children were asleep, we discussed options. Thomas offered to connect me with colleagues who specialized in family law, but I shook my head. "This is what I do," I said. "I've helped dozens of clients protect their children from abusive relatives. I need to handle this myself." The first step was research. Susan's petition painted her as a loving grandmother who had changed her ways and deserved a relationship with her grandchildren. She claimed we had a minor disagreement when I was a teenager that had been blown out of proportion, and that she had tried repeatedly to reconcile over the years. But I had rebuffed her. None of it was true. There had been no reconciliation attempts, no changed circumstances, just strategic lies to manipulate the legal system. 2 weeks later came the mandatory mediation session where parties were required to attempt resolution before proceeding to court. I arrived with Thomas and my documentation. Susan came with her attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit, who introduced himself as Gerald Kemp. Seeing Susan after 18 years was surreal. She had aged, her once dark hair now silver lines etched around her mouth and eyes. but the calculating look she gave me was unchanged. This was the same woman who had terrorized my childhood, now just in an older package. "Valerie," she said, her voice warm, eyes cold. "You look well, successful." I didn't respond directly. Instead, I turned to the mediator. "I'd like to state for the record that I have not had any contact with Susan Ross since I was 16 years old, when she forcibly expelled me from her home, resulting in my homelessness." Susan's face registered shock that I would speak so directly. She'd expected me to maintain the facade of politeness to play along with her fiction of a minor family squabble. Her attorney quickly jumped in. "My client acknowledges there were difficulties in the past, but she's undergone extensive therapy and personal growth. She simply wants to know her grandchildren to be part of their lives in whatever capacity their parents deem appropriate." The mediation continued with this pattern. Susan's attorney presenting her as a reformed woman deserving of a second chance. Me providing factual accounts of abuse that her attorney tried to minimize as parenting from a different era or misunderstandings between a headstrong teenager and a struggling single mother. When Susan spoke, she wielded guilt like a weapon. "I made mistakes," she admitted, tears welling on cue. "But to deny me any contact with my grandchildren seems cruel. I'm getting older. I may not have many years left." She looked imploringly at the mediator. "Is it right to punish the children for things that happened before they were born, to deprive them of a grandmother who loves them?" It was a masterful performance. If I hadn't lived through her abuse, I might have been moved. The mediator certainly seemed sympathetic, suggesting perhaps limited supervised visitation could be considered. I remained firm. "There will be no visitation. My children's safety and emotional well-being are non-negotiable." The mediation ended in an impasse, meaning the case would proceed to a formal hearing. As we gathered our materials to leave, Susan approached me whispering so only I could hear. "You always were ungrateful," she hissed. "I'll make sure your children know what kind of person their mother really is." A chill ran through me. This wasn't about reconnecting with grandchildren she'd never met. This was about regaining control over me, using my children as leverage. As Thomas and I drove home, panic began to set in. What if a judge believes her? What if they grant visitation? She'll do to them what she did to me. Thomas reached for my hand. "We won't let that happen," he promised. "We'll fight this with everything we have." That night I couldn't sleep. Images of Susan with Emma and James haunted me. I imagined her whispering poison into their ears, undermining their sense of security, planting seeds of the same self-doubt she'd cultivated in me. By morning, I was resolved. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight for my children's future, and I would use every resource available to win it. I took a temporary leave from work to focus entirely on building our case. First, I reached out to Ms. Thompson, now retired, but still living in the same city. She immediately agreed to testify about my condition as a teenager after being kicked out. Next, I contacted Sarah from the youth shelter. Though the shelter kept most records confidential, Sarah could testify to the general circumstances of my arrival and the legal emancipation process. Most crucially, I began investigating Susan's life since our estrangement. Through careful research and some assistance from a private investigator colleague, I discovered Susan had been through 2 more marriages, both ending in allegations of emotional abuse. There was a restraining order filed by her most recent ex-husband, though it had expired years ago. I also found a police report from 5 years earlier when Susan had been arrested for assault after an altercation with a neighbor. She'd completed community service and anger management classes in exchange for the charges being dropped. None of these were ancient history. All had occurred well after the period when she claimed to have reformed. As the hearing date approached, my symptoms of PTSD, long managed through therapy and medication, flared dramatically. Nightmares returned. Panic attacks struck without warning. During a practice session with Thomas, who was role-playing opposing counsel, I became so overwhelmed I couldn't continue. Dr. Marshall, my therapist from college, who I'd continued seeing periodically, helped me develop strategies to manage the renewed trauma responses. "You're not that powerless teenager anymore," she reminded me. "You have resources, knowledge, support. This is triggering past trauma, but it's not the same situation." The day before the hearing, I received an unexpected call from Gerald Kemp, Susan's attorney. "My client is willing to consider dropping her petition," he said smoothly, "if you'll agree to periodic updates about the children. Photos, school reports, that sort of thing." It was a trap. Once I started providing information, the demands would escalate. Susan was testing whether I'd still give in to avoid conflict. "No," I replied. "We'll see you in court." The family court was housed in a modern building downtown. Thomas and I arrived early, meeting with Ms. Thompson and Sarah in a conference room to review final preparations. My hands shook as I organized my notes, but my mind was clear. I knew exactly what needed to be done. When we entered the courtroom, Susan was already seated with her attorney. She wore a conservative dress, her hair neatly styled, looking every bit the respectable grandmother seeking reasonable contact with beloved grandchildren. She nodded solemnly to the judge as proceedings began. Kemp presented his case, first painting Susan as a devoted mother who had made mistakes but had spent years bettering herself. He emphasized her community involvement, her regular church attendance, her work with a local charity. He presented affidavits from neighbors and church members attesting to her character. "Your Honor," he concluded, "all Mrs. Ross wants is to know her grandchildren. Is that not a reasonable request from a woman who has demonstrated such personal growth?" Then it was my turn. I approached the podium, my legal training overriding the anxiety threatening to close my throat. "Your Honor," I began, "this case is not about a grandmother's right to know her grandchildren. It's about protecting two innocent children from a woman with a documented history of abuse that continues to the present day." I methodically presented the evidence I'd gathered. Ms. Thompson testified about finding me homeless and malnourished at 16. Sarah described the trauma symptoms I exhibited at the shelter. I submitted the police report and restraining order information. Then I addressed the court directly. "When I was 16 years old, Susan Ross threw me out of her house for wanting to attend an academic summer program. I became homeless, vulnerable, and was subsequently sexually exploited by an older man who took advantage of my situation." I paused, making eye contact with the judge. I do not share this painful history lightly. I do so because it directly resulted from Susan Ross's actions and because it demonstrates the very real harm she is capable of inflicting. Susan's face had grown progressively darker during my presentation. When I mentioned the sexual exploitation, she leaned over to whisper furiously to her attorney. Kemp requested a brief recess, which the judge granted. In the hallway, Kemp approached me with Susan hovering behind him. "We'd like to propose a settlement," he said stiffly. "My client will withdraw her petition if you agree not to pursue any counterclaims or sanctions." They were retreating, looking for a way to save face. I glanced at Susan, whose expression had shifted from righteous indignation to barely concealed panic. "No," I said clearly. "I want the judge to rule on this." When court resumed, I continued presenting evidence, including testimonials from mental health professionals about the potential harm of forcing children into relationships with individuals who had histories of abuse, even if that abuse wasn't directed at the children themselves. Finally, I addressed Susan's claims of change directly. "Your Honor, the respondent would have this court believe she's a different person now. Yet her actions tell a different story. She didn't reach out when I graduated college, when I got married, when my children were born. She appeared only after seeing my name in a public forum, using the legal system not to establish a genuine relationship, but as a mechanism of control." I looked directly at Susan for the first time. The same pattern of manipulation and emotional abuse evident in her subsequent marriages and relationships is being employed here. I respectfully ask the court to see through this facade and protect my children from exposure to someone who has demonstrated consistent capacity for harm. The judge's ruling was decisive. Not only was Susan's petition for visitation denied, but the court issued a no-contact order prohibiting her from attempting to communicate with me or my family through any means. Additionally, she was barred from coming within 500 feet of our home, the children's school, or my workplace. As we exited the courtroom, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying for 18 years. Susan glared at me from across the lobby, her mask of grandmotherly concern replaced by the familiar rage I remembered from childhood. But this time, I didn't flinch. I met her gaze steadily until she turned away defeated. Outside, Thomas wrapped me in a tight embrace. "You did it," he whispered into my hair. "It's over." But we both knew it wasn't that simple. The legal battle might be resolved, but the emotional aftermath was just beginning. The weeks following the court victory were unexpectedly difficult. Instead of feeling triumphant, I found myself emotionally exhausted processing decades of trauma that had been freshly stirred. Nightmares returned. I'd wake gasping, sometimes crying out images of both Susan and Jack tangled together in my subconscious. Thomas was endlessly patient, holding me through panic attacks, reassuring me when I'd check the locks multiple times before bed. "They can't hurt you anymore," he'd remind me gently. "You've made sure of that." I returned to therapy this time with a new focus, not just coping with past trauma, but truly integrating it into my understanding of myself. "You've spent years compartmentalizing," Dr. Marshall observed. "That was a necessary survival skill, but now you have the opportunity to become whole, to acknowledge all parts of your journey." Gradually, the acute symptoms subsided. The nightmares became less frequent, the hypervigilance less consuming. In their place came a deeper sense of closure than I'd ever experienced. For the first time, I had faced my abuser not as a powerless child or a traumatized teenager, but as a capable adult who could protect herself and her family. 3 months after the hearing, I made a decision that surprised even me. I gathered Emma and James, now 8 and 6, and shared a carefully age-appropriate version of their family history. "A long time ago," I explained, sitting with them on our living room couch, "your grandmother was not a nice person to me. She didn't know how to be a good mom, and she hurt me in ways that weren't okay." "Did she hit you?" James asked, his small face serious. "Sometimes," I answered honestly. "But the worst hurts were the ones no one could see. The way she made me feel about myself." "Is that why we don't see her?" Emma asked. I nodded. "She hasn't learned how to be kind or safe, so we need to keep our distance. That's why we went to court, to make sure she understands that." "Are you still sad about it?" Emma's perception always amazed me. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I have you and Daddy and our wonderful life together. And I have all the things I learned from that hard time, like how important it is that we always treat each other with kindness and respect in our family." The conversation continued with simple questions and simple answers. There were parts I didn't share details they were too young to understand, but the foundation was laid for ongoing dialogue as they grew. That fall, I made another significant decision. Using my legal background and personal experience, I founded a nonprofit organization called Phoenix Path, dedicated to providing comprehensive support for teenagers escaping abuse. The organization offered legal advocacy, mental health services, educational assistance, and transitional housing, all integrated into a single program. The shelter where I had once stayed served as our model, but with expanded services informed by both professional research and lived experience. Within a year, we were helping dozens of young people rebuild their lives. I remained at my legal position part-time, but devoted significant energy to developing Phoenix Path. Thomas supported this shift wholeheartedly, even taking on pro bono legal work for the organization. Our home became a gathering place for board meetings and fundraising strategy sessions. Through this work, I connected with other survivors who had transformed their own trauma into advocacy. These relationships were profound, built on mutual understanding that required no explanation. For the first time, I found myself able to speak openly about my experiences without shame, recognizing that my story could help others find their way forward. Emma and James grew up witnessing this evolution. They saw their mother standing up for vulnerable teenagers, speaking at community events, testifying before state legislators about youth homelessness and abuse. They absorbed the lesson that pain can become purpose, that healing happens through action and connection. I never heard from Susan again. The court order ensured legal distance, and I suspect her pride prevented any genuine attempt at reconciliation. Occasionally, I would wonder about her, whether age had brought any self-reflection or regret. But those thoughts no longer carried emotional charge. She was simply a figure from my past, not a force in my present. Jack remained a more complicated shadow. I never pursued legal action against him, a decision I sometimes questioned. Had there been other vulnerable girls after me? Could I have prevented harm to others? These questions had no satisfying answers, only the acknowledgement that each survivor must make their own choices about confronting abusers based on their unique circumstances and capacity. What sustained me through these occasional doubts was the tangible impact of Phoenix Path. Each time a teenager secured safe housing, enrolled in college, or gained legal independence, I saw the ripple effects of breaking cycles of abuse. These were victories that couldn't be undone, lives permanently altered for the better. On the 10th anniversary of the court case, Thomas organized a surprise gathering at our home. Friends who had supported us through that difficult time, colleagues from the legal community who had offered guidance, and several young adults who had been among Phoenix Path's first clients came together to celebrate. As I looked around at the faces of people who had been part of my journey, I was struck by how far I had traveled from that terrified 16-year-old girl with nowhere to go. The path had been unimaginably difficult, marked by pain I wouldn't wish on anyone. Yet standing there, surrounded by my family and community, I felt a sense of peace that once seemed impossible. Perhaps the deepest healing came in my relationship with Emma and James. Watching them grow in an environment of safety and unconditional love, seeing them develop confidence and compassion, I realized that the cycle had truly been broken. The legacy of abuse that had defined my childhood would not touch theirs. When Emma turned 16, the age I had been when everything fell apart, I took her to lunch, just the two of us. "You know," I told her, "when I was your age, I couldn't imagine the life I have now. I want you to know how grateful I am to be your mom, to see you growing into such an amazing person." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. In that moment, I understood that my children saw not just my trauma, but my resilience. Not just what had been done to me, but what I had built from the ruins. The greatest victory wasn't winning the court case against Susan. It wasn't founding Phoenix Path or helping other survivors. It was this creating a family where love wasn't conditional, where safety wasn't a privilege to be earned, where my children could look at their mother and see not brokenness, but strength. Maybe the deepest pain in my life wasn't what my mother did to me, but realizing I had almost let that fear define my entire existence. But today, looking into my children's eyes, I know that sometimes the most beautiful story isn't one without suffering, but one about how we rise above it. If you've experienced abuse or know someone who has, please know you're not alone. The cycle can be broken. There is life, love, and purpose waiting on the other side of trauma. I'd love to hear your thoughts on healing and resilience in the comments. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support more conversations about overcoming adversity. And remember, share this with someone who might need to hear that their past doesn't determine their future. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you find strength in your own journey, whatever it may be.